Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to the CORE webinar. My name is Charles Hecker and I'm a senior partner at Control Risks. Joining me today is Nicolas Reys, our head of cyber threat intelligence. We are coming to you live from the Control Risks studio on the south bank of the River Thames in London, and it's looking pretty sunny outside. To our existing clients who are connected to CORE, welcome back. And to anyone who is discovering CORE for the first time today, we hope you find this an informative and useful session. The conflation of geopolitical and cyber hotspots shows no sign of slowing in 2018. This is also a very big cyber enforcement year, with new data regulation coming into effect that will impact companies around the world. Today, we're going to show you how cyber and digital transformation meets geopolitics. And to take you through this journey, we're going to showcase CORE, our new risk monitoring toolkit. But before we go any further, a few housekeeping notes. Everyone who dialed in today will get a recording of the webinar with a copy of the slides. And anyone you know who wasn't able to attend but did register will also get a copy of the presentation. Nick and I are going to try to keep our remarks to about 20 minutes today and allow some time for Q&A at the end. You can send us your questions at any time during the webinar by typing them into the dialog box on your screen, and you should be seeing a little example of how to do that. Before we focus on our main topic, Nick and I would like to take a moment to introduce CORE for the benefit of those of you who may not be familiar with the platform. CORE is the essential risk monitoring toolkit that allows you to evaluate opportunities, risks, and threats around the world. CORE provides incisive analysis and forecasting on geopolitical and security issues, a series of country risk ratings, and an extensive database of incidents. Coupled with visualization and analytical tools, these help you make informed business decisions and plan your operations in advance. Nick, over to you.
That's right, Chuck. And more specifically, what CORE provides you is with daily global coverage of security and political incidents across more than 200 countries and territories, risk ratings that enable you to evaluate and compare countries across a range of security, operational, and political dimensions that can be filtered, visualized, and tracked over time. We also have powerful mapping capabilities that enable you to understand the local threat environment for your operations by visualizing your assets alongside incident data and risk rating overlays on our dynamic mapping tools. We have in-depth analysis that's provided by geopolitical and security experts on a range of issues on a day-to-day basis, as well as customizable tools that can make the reporting bespoke to your requirements, such as by dropping your particular assets on top of these mapping features that I just discussed. But CORE is about so much more, isn't it, Chuck?
Yes, it is, Nick. So CORE can also be extended with specialist modules and services to provide additional coverage of key focus areas. Nick.
That's right. On the cyber side, our Plus Cyber module provides sector-specific analysis of cyber threat actors, their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and trends that we've been witnessing with mitigation advice that enable you to strategize and plan your response to this increasingly important challenge that we're going to focus on today. We've got strategic context enabling us to understand how threat actors operate, just not in the cyber threat landscape, but also tying back to geopolitics.
One of my favorites, the Plus Economics module, delivers analysis of economic and geopolitical risk through ratings, in-depth country profiles, and event-driven analysis provided by Control Risks and our joint venture partner, Oxford Economics.
On the maritime side, we also have analysis and monitoring of maritime security events combined with powerful planning tools, which help you identify, assess, and mitigate risks specific to the maritime environment.
You can bolt on a political module, which is going to give you in-depth analysis of regulatory, contract, and integrity issues with scenario forecasting on more than 100 countries. And if you're feeling lonely, we've got Analyst Access, your direct link to our multinational and multidisciplinary team, taken from backgrounds including professional services, law, cybersecurity, technology services, academia, law enforcement, intelligence services, and the military. They're going to give you advice that is tailored to your organization's operation and footprint. We're done with the propaganda. So let's get into the meat of the presentation. On a day like today, Nick, we could talk about a series of issues to highlight the risk monitoring toolkit. We could talk, for example, about North Korea.
We could talk about trade and protectionism.
We could talk about China and the Belt and Road Project and infrastructure in Africa.
Topically, we could also talk about electoral interference, and especially in the US presidential elections of last year.
Or we could talk about the disastrous state of East-West relations. And guess what? Today, we're actually going to talk about each and every one of these because in modern geopolitics, every single one of them has a cyber aspect. Cyber is underpinning almost every geopolitical hotspot that we can identify in 2018. And we think that this is the new digital battlefield. So let's go straight in to North Korea. Let's start with the politics. And for those of you who follow these events fairly closely, some of this is going to be familiar. On the political side, talks have begun on a potential summit between the US and North Korea. This is without question an encouraging sign. North Korea and the tensions on the Korean Peninsula were control risk's #1 risk out of our top 5 for 2018. That said, there is still room for diplomacy and summitry talks to break down. US Secretary of State nominee Mike Pompeo has publicly declared his support for a diplomatic resolution. But at the center of these diplomatic efforts is denuclearization. As was the case with Iran, North Korea's nuclear program isn't really the only issue. Right, Nick?
That's right, Chuck. And when it comes to cyber and cyber attacks more specifically, North Korea has spearheaded some of the most damaging and significant cyber attacks over the past couple of years. Just casting our minds back to last spring, about this time of year actually, we had an extremely disruptive global extortive attack that impacted hundreds of companies across the world that has been tied back to the now infamous Lazarus Group, a hacking unit tied to the North Korean military apparatus. What's particularly interesting is we're expecting that as these military tensions rescind and as diplomatic talks get underway, North Korea is likely to continue using cyber as a means to influence its position in the diplomatic discourse with the West.
Nick, we promised to show a little bit about the impact on business of the combination of cyber and geopolitics. Are there any triggers that businesses should be looking for, or what are the key things to focus on to understand the future development of events in North Korea?
Chuck, I think from our perspective, it's really about understanding the intent and capabilities of the actors linked with the North Korean government. The economic isolation and the impact of sanctions have pushed North Korean state units to start targeting the private sector for financial gains. Famously, the hack of several central banks, and most notoriously of the Bangladesh Central Bank back in 2015 and 2016, were likely driven by North Korea's desire to find new sources of revenue for its government. Equally importantly, we've talked about this disruption that North Korea has spearheaded. We need to look for indicators that would suggest a breakdown in the political and diplomatic current status of things to start anticipating wide-scale, private sector-focused disruption across the West from North Korea.
Wow, sounds a little bit scary, Nick, but thanks for that. We're going to move on to our next geopolitical and cyber hotspot, and it's actually a global hotspot. Before we jump into this, let me just remind you that you are very welcome to type a question at any time into the Q&A dialog box on your screen, and it'll pop up here in London, and we'll be very happy to answer your questions as we get towards the end of the webinar. We're going to talk now about protectionism. And as it so happens, protectionism was another one of Control Risk's top 5 risks for 2018. And this particular risk shows no sign of weakening. On the politics, the messages from the White House are incredibly confusing when it comes to trade, and they're coming at whiplash speed. The US seems to have embraced a zero-sum transactional approach to trade, and US trade policy, and I use that word policy fairly lightly, is being dictated by tactical national security issues and domestic politics. I mean, just look at the rhetoric around NAFTA and the wall. Nick, economic nationalism, generally speaking, is not great for international business. What's cooking on the cyber front?
On the cyber front, I think it's a continuation of exactly what you're identifying here, which is a conflation of security issues with domestic economic protectionism. I think before specifically jumping into the impact on the cyber side, it's good to remind everybody that in 2018, we're seeing the results of an initial wave of a form of protectionism, which is really around the setting up of data jurisdictions across the world. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation is coming into enforcement next month. The Chinese cybersecurity law has begun to be enforced. We're also seeing the Network Information Security Directive coming into EU member state law in a week and a half, as a matter of fact, on the 8th of May. And more broadly, we're seeing these legislative debates around data jurisdictions happening in India, in Brazil, in the US. We're going to see more and more of those. But to go back more specifically on the protectionist agenda, we have seen an increasing number of private sector companies being denounced or outright banned in certain countries for alleged national security concerns. And if you're thinking more of the latest ZTE debates in the US, for instance, that's a clear example. States are now looking at cybersecurity and security issues as a way to protect their economic turf and their sovereignty.
But Nick, how are we going to figure out, what are the signs of understanding which high-tech deals are vulnerable to this sort of extra government scrutiny?
This is the million-dollar question, Chuck, if not $1 billion, as a matter of fact. It's increasingly difficult. National security exemptions are nothing to international trade rules, are nothing new. Essentially, since 1947 and the beginning of multinational trade on a global scale, this has happened. The big difference is historically they've been tied to the industries of war, whether that's coal and steel or defense manufacture. But now that more and more governments are realizing the importance of data, the importance of technology, we are seeing companies in the telecommunication area, in the technology space, coming under increasing scrutiny, and that is not going to change. So it's about understanding the security implications of technology in order to understand what's going to happen.
Nick, thanks. We're starting to see some questions come in, so please do type your questions, hit enter, and they'll pop up on our screens here in London. If we don't get a chance to answer your question live, we will absolutely respond to everybody individually by email, I'd say probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. By the way, before we move on, just by way of explanation, one of the things that you're seeing on your screen in front of you are snapshots from the core service that underline and highlight the analysis that Nick and I are discussing today. So we're going to move on to Africa. Nick, fasten your seatbelts. China in Africa will continue to be an absolutely dominant force in infrastructure development. If we just take one country, and that's Cameroon, Chinese contractors account for more than 70% of large-scale infrastructure projects in that country. And that's because the Belt and Road project is going to wrap itself right around Africa. What's interesting, though, is that China is now experiencing many of the same market entry problems in Africa as other investors historically have. Nick, tell us about what some of these problems are in the cyber world.
Yeah, Chuck, I think Africa is a fascinating continent when it comes to cybersecurity. For a long time, it's been both because of a lack of infrastructure and a general lack of available information and intelligence, ignored somewhat by a lot of people. But I think increasingly, we have intelligence that suggests and data that shows that more and more attacks are happening across the continent. And that's spurred by two systemic and structural factors, which is the increasing interest of foreign states in investing in the continent and a growing domestic capability. A very young population, increasingly connected, that is adopting technology at an unprecedented rate means that we are seeing a domestic ecosystem increasingly focused on using cyber as a means to generate money. And that's directly impacting private businesses in Africa.
Nick, we're going to jump over the ocean now to the United States. And unless you've been on a very secluded holiday for the past year or so, you will know that Russia is widely blamed for having interfered in the 2016 US presidential elections. This is probably one of the clearest pointers at the intersection of political and cyber risk. Here's the scene, though. Midterm congressional elections are coming up in the United States, and the Mexican elections, a critical decision, are also on the horizon. Russia has clearly taken a stance towards destabilizing Western political institutions. Nick, back to you again. Take us through a little bit this integration of cyber and political risk as it pertains to the electoral process in Western democracies.
Chuck, I think if there was any example to really highlight the conflation between politics and cyber, the electoral processes, and particularly casting our mind back to the 2016 presidential election in the US, is the best one. We've already had explicit and overt warnings by Mike Pompeo that the Russian government was starting to look at interfering in the midterms elections. We've already had similar chatter coming from the Mexican elections. We are seeing states in the region also quickly learning their lessons from the 2016 presidential elections in the US in order to gain control of a geopolitical narrative and a geopolitical progress in that particular region. But this isn't limited to the Americas. This is happening across the world.
Nick, there will always be people who seek to influence elections. There will always be protests in front of parliaments, and people will always wave posters and what have you. You can chase people out from in front of City Hall. You can chase people off of public premises. What do you do, though, when these people, if you will, are gathered in cyberspace?
An excellent question. I think we've entered into a new era of politics where opinions are now increasingly shaped online, and I think we really yet to fully comprehend the extent to which this is an efficient tactic. There is an increasing overlap between the digital and the physical space. We've seen organizations being, brought down online and then having physical protests against them. You can, to some degree, chase the cyberspace that these guys operate in or chase these individuals. But at the end of the day, from a private sector perspective, it's about maximizing the opportunities that this new digital space offers. So I think it's about understanding exactly the way people operate in these digital influence campaigns. What is their intent? What are they trying to drive? And how can we as an organization, as security professionals, geopolitical risk analysts, really start to understand the trajectory of the next electoral cycle or of the next large-scale online protests?
Nick, thanks for that. There are two things that I really like about the questions that are coming in. First of all, they're incredibly difficult and challenging. And secondly, they're all directed to Nick. So send us a few more and continue to send them to Nick's attention. We're going to move on to the last bit of our trot around the globe, and we're going to focus on tensions between the EU and Russia. But first of all, Nick, is it right of us to think that Russia is the world's leading cyber actor?
Chuck, I think it depends on what you call leading, but the answer to that broadly is no. Is Russia the most publicly denounced and decried in the West? Yes, absolutely. Is Russia actively engaged in this? Yes, absolutely. Is Russia the only one? Absolutely not. Is Russia the most advanced one? I think evidence is coming out of several significant leaks seem to highlight that Western intelligence agencies are just as active on the matter.
You know, we've put this here because of all of the talk that we hear about a return to the Cold War or about East-West relations being at the worst time in history. And the question has become particularly acute in the wake of a nerve agent poisoning of 2 Russians in the town of Salisbury here in England. We believe that an unstable European Union, up to a point, is a Russian foreign policy goal, and we think that any lack of unity in the EU, whether it's economic or political, provides a point for Russia to exploit. And I think the hope here is that an unstable EU would also lead to an unstable NATO as a military threat. And so, Nick, the question to you from me is the military battlefield a new cyber battlefield?
That's an interesting question, Chuck, and I think it requires a fairly nuanced answer. I think if we take a step back on the case of EU-Russia relations, we have very strong precedent that indicates that any sanctions being imposed or reaffirmed by the European Union will be followed by retaliatory cyber attacks. The energy and oil and gas sectors were heavily targeted by Russian campaigns following the sanctions imposed by the European Union following the issues in Crimea in 2014. But as a matter of fact, the escalatory rhetoric you're talking about here between the UK and Russia is also likely going to trigger more activity, not just from Russia's side onto UK and NATO allies, but actually from UK and NATO allies. Remember Barack Obama's statements after the revelations, the public revelations of the 2016 electoral influence cycle by US intelligence agencies, that the American government would retaliate both covertly and overtly. And we anticipate this to continue. Don't also forget about Ukraine as a key laboratory for current hybrid warfare / the beginning of what we're likely to see in the military space with cyber attacks. And this has been the case with more and more disruptive attacks that impacted companies across the world, with the NotPetyas and the Bad Rabbits of last year. And we believe that that is one of the key elements that's going to be indicative of the future of cybersecurity for the private sector, is how far can we push that red line before we get into military retaliation? How disruptive can we be before somebody reacts?
Okay, on that happy note, we're going to move to the Q&A, and they continue to pop into the Q&A box. So first of all, thank you very, very much for your questions. I'm just going to essentially pose them to Nick in the order that they came in, and on a couple of these, I might actually add a little bit of my own spin just to keep it interesting. So the first question we have is that it says this: top officials from major US intelligence agencies, including the CIA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, have suggested people should not use devices made by Chinese manufacturers, including Huawei or ZTE. The question is, do these statements describe a credible threat, or are they protectionist positioning? And if you don't mind me, Nick, I'm just going to add to that. You know, there are countries around the world that have built their entire mobile phone networks on foreign equipment, Chinese and otherwise. Does that mean that they don't care about these sorts of issues? Please have a go at the first question.
Yeah, so on the first question, I think if we look at the positioning that the British government, the UK government has taken on this particular issue, they have continued to authorize the use of these devices. I would also pinpoint that at the moment, only the US intelligence agencies have made these allegations. It is very difficult to reverse engineer these systems to confirm the potential credibility of the threat. However, like with any telecommunications system, the possibility of backdoors being in place is non-negligible. And remember the revelations following the Snowden leaks of the NSA having potentially installed several hundreds of backdoors across devices like Cisco devices, this is likely something to bear in mind when we're considering what to do when procuring these types of hardware. But I do think there is a significant degree of protectionism in place in these enforcement and in these bans.
Frankly, I think one of the reasons why this is such a good question is it actually goes directly to what we've been trying to say, and that is this is one of those areas where cyber and the new geopolitics again intersect perfectly, and the questioner is right to try to separate out these two issues, but it's going to be increasingly difficult to do that. Nick, let's move on. There's another question that's come in that says, what does data show when it comes to attacks on the oil industry in the US? So this is a pretty specific one, Nick. Have a go.
Yeah, so in terms of the kind of key trends that we're seeing against the oil and gas industry in the US, state espionage is still a huge concern. And from a point of view of more disruptive attacks, we have seen increasing data pinpointing that some foreign states, particularly the likes of Iran, have been looking at gaining a foothold on these networks for potential assessed disruptive operations. One of the key trends I think that's remarkable in the oil and gas industry is actually we have seen top criminal groups, organized cyber criminal groups that were historically focused on the financial sector, so directly compromising banking infrastructure, shifting their attention to the oil and gas industry. This is largely due to the fact that the oil and gas industry relies on industrial control systems, networks that need to be up and running 24/7. And if you're a criminal and you're looking to make money, extorting by blocking these systems for a given period of time is likely going to yield to ransom payments much more efficiently than just locking up data. And that's a key trend we're seeing against the oil and gas sector in the US and more broadly globally.
You know, here in London, it's a little bit early in the morning to be talking about things that are quite this sort of dramatic, but that question and your response actually leads very nicely into another question that has come in, because you were talking about industrial control systems in oil and gas. And so the next question is, how credible are cyber attacks on power generation, water, gas, and indeed oil infrastructure as weapons of global warfare?
That's a fascinating question, and I think it's difficult to give a clear answer given that the lack of precedent is stark. The theory goes that the level of interconnectedness of critical national infrastructure, so including power, water, gas, oil, is growing on a day-to-day basis. And as new technologies are adopted, as industrial technologies and ICS 2.0, as it's called in the industry, are being adopted, that credibility of essentially harming one point of the network to take the majority of it down is significant. One of the reasons why at the moment it is not a credible weapon of global warfare is twofold. We have no retaliatory precedent. We have no understanding of what, say, the US government would do should a foreign state launch an attack like this. And from a deterrence perspective, it's much better to demonstrate that you have access than to actually trigger that attack, which would likely be considered military.
So in other words, you can't have war unless there are two people who want to go into battle.
Yeah.
So on that encouraging note, we are just about out of time. Nick and I promised to let everyone go at 30 minutes, and we're almost there, which means it's time to say a few thank yous. First of all, to my co-host, Nick Reys. Nick, thank you very, very much for your fantastic commentary, and a very big thank you to executive producer Christopher Smith. And of course, we would like to thank everybody who dialed in today for setting aside some time to talk with us today about cyber, political risk, and our new core platform. If you are interested in having a closer look at core, or if you've got any follow-up questions for Nick or for me, please get in touch with us at the email address you see on your screen, and we will be very happy to respond to every email that we get. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again very much, and good morning from London.